Hello and welcome, everyone. Welcome to joining us to the File Review Process webinar brought to you by the State Performance Plan Technical Assistance Project, that's SPP-TAP. My name is Connie Silva and I'm the director for the project, and Happy New Year to everyone. It's wonderful to see all of you joining us. We're expecting a large group today. I'm going to ask you to right now just to take a minute and write your name if you haven't already and what your organization that you're with in chat, so that we know who's with us here today. And again, we're so very excited. Happy New Year to all of you. I know that you're going to love today's webinar. I'm really excited about our presenter and the content, so I'll introduce her in just a minute. Yeah, I see all of the folks popping up and so many familiar names. Again, we're really happy to have you guys here. So a couple things we want you to know is the way in which we're going to communicate today. Look at all of the people. It's wonderful. We're going to ask you to write in chat when you're needing to pose a question for this webinar. And in order to do that, I want to make sure that you change who you're writing to. So in the chat box, you'll want to make sure that you have put it to panelists and attendees. Otherwise, we all can't see what you're writing. So if you could make sure to change that little blue panel to make sure that it says to panelists and attendees, that would be great. And I know that you're going to have questions for our presenter, Dr. Mary Bacon, so you can go ahead and put those in chat as the questions arise, but we are going to wait until the end of the session to respond to your questions, and we have left some time, so we will definitely respond to them, but we want to make sure to not interrupt the flow of her content today. So as a reminder, today's session is being recorded. So if you, for any reason, want to come back and refresh what you heard, you can check the archives. We archive and put them up on our website. Also, if you want to share this information with somebody after the fact, you're welcome to let them know about it. Our webinars are always free and archived. I also do want to remind you again, as I said, this project is brought to you by the California Department of Education. We have funding through the department, and our project, if you're not familiar with us, our main focus is supporting districts that are dealing with disproportionality and significant disproportionality. So you'll hear some of that talk today during the session, but today's content is definitely valuable and helpful to anyone, even if you are not currently dealing with disproportionality. So with that, I also want to remind folks that we do have closed captioning on this. That's an option that's available to you if you need that. You can click on the little box, it'll give you the captions. So let me move forward. I want to introduce our presenter, Dr. Mary Bacon. We're very excited to have her here with us, and I know a lot of you are familiar with her, and that's why you're actually here, to hear from her. So let me just give you a brief introduction. We've been working with Dr. Mary Bacon for quite a while, but Dr. Mary Bacon's journey from the projects in the South and tenements in the Northeast to the role of consultant was a varied and exciting one. These experiences make her uniquely prepared, both personally and professionally, to address issues related to achieving equity for those who are racially, ethnically, and socially culturally different, as well as those who come from the challenging circumstances. Educated in elementary and secondary parochial schools in New Orleans and Harlem, she became the first one in her family to graduate from elementary school and understands the challenges of overcoming obstacles to achieve success. Mary earned her BA in secondary education from Fordham University, majoring in Spanish, an MA in guidance and counseling, and a PhD in social psychology from Stanford University. As an experienced teacher, university instructor, counselor, psychologist, and school administrator in a variety of educational institutions, Mary has also served as a probation officer and as a field deputy in the California State Attorney General's office. And what we're really excited about in Mary in her current role is a TA technical assistance facilitator with the State Performance Plan Technical Assistance Project. And we are, as I said, thrilled to have her here with us. And I don't want to take up any more of her time, so I'm going to pass it on to Mary. Thank you very much, Mary. Welcome.
Well, thank you very, very much, Connie, for that wonderful introduction. It's interesting because every time I have to hear it, go through it, I realize how old I am. And as you notice in that picture before, I told the photographer as long as I kept looking like that, I was going to keep purchasing that that ticket, but that picture. Um, but unfortunately, I had to do this video so you see the real me today. Um, One of the things also about that introduction is you will notice as I do this presentation um, is that people always select those things about your educational background and where you went to school and what kinds of professional training that you have had to introduce you. But as you will see from this presentation, um, I'm going to be talking about a different set of qualifications for this presentation because I believe that how I came to this process is much more through my lived experiences than through my formal education. My life's work has been in advocacy for the underserved wherever you find them. And um, I have learned a great deal working with SPP-TAP um, around disproportionality, which I'll talk about in a minute, um, because it gave me an opportunity to focus on seeing the world from multiple perspectives. Um, Welcome. Today, I'm going to be talking about a topic that I was frankly very surprised about the number of people. As a matter of fact, how many people are registered for this session?
Mary, over 600 are registered and we have 416 online right now.
You're kidding.
Nope. They want to hear you.
I don't get it. But they did tell me, they said, don't worry about it. You will have an audience. The people who come are people who love Zoom meetings. And you notice Connie talked about how excited she was. She's heard this already, but she keeps coming back. I had a friend who told me once that he wished that he had died in a faculty meeting or Zoom meeting because the transition between life and death would have been so subtle. And so if you guys like being here, um, I am very, very happy that you find a topic that sounds um, not terribly interesting about the file review process as something that you want to hear about. Um, the topic and the title I'm talking about is Revisiting Students' Journeys Through the Educational System and how we can use the file review process as a vehicle for gathering qualitative data. Um, there's enough. Before I go further, let me try another thing so that I understand about how I can shape this to fit all the people who have signed up for it. Let's do a little poll so that you can share with me what your role is. Are you an administrator? Are you a teacher, an instructional staff, support staff, psychologist, family community member, or some other category? That will help me to be able to shape the kinds of examples that I give as I go through this presentation.
The votes are rolling in. Mary, we're about halfway through, 3/4 of the way through. And it's heavily weighted in the administrator's favor. We'll give another minute or two for the rest of the folks to chime in, and then I'll share the poll with you. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share now. So as you can see, we got a lot of administrators, but we've got some folks from other places as well.
Okay, this helps me. It really does help me, particularly the two largest groups are administrators and psychologists. And it will help me to be able to shape this presentation in a way that's relevant for the majority of the people in the group. I have two very brief goals for this session because of its length. The first of which is that I hope that I hope that as a result of this presentation, you will at the end of it understand the basis of a file review that can be used as a vehicle for gathering qualitative data. But just as important, I'm hoping that in this hour and a half, that you will also have a sense about how you can facilitate your own file reviews in a variety of settings. Um, I'm going to get some help with doing this presentation. I brought with me two people who are going to come to you by way of a recording as opposed to live. Dr. James Adams, who's a director of special education in the Jefferson Elementary School District, and Dr. Holly Wade, who is the assistant superintendent of educational support services in the Cabrillo Unified School District at the time that she participated in the file review. But let me just do one more poll before we go any further. I'd like to get a sense about how many of you have ever participated in a file review yourself. This is a quick one, a yes or no.
Those numbers are rolling in. We're about halfway through. Well, we're 3/4 of the way through. We're almost done. It's slowing down, so I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share.
Okay, so you see what I mean? They came anyway. People said, you know, most of the people have already done file reviews before. But this is going to be, I hope, a somewhat different experience. But let me start with how I came to this process, and provide some background for you about how I came to develop this tool. Because you are mostly administrators, you probably know this, but I want to ensure that we're all on the same page. I'm sorry. One of the things you've learned already is my greatest strength is not in the area of technology. So I'm so glad that we have these other people who can help me to do this. I want to make sure that we all have the same definition and understanding of that term disproportionality. Disproportionality occurs when students of a specific racial or ethnic group are identified for special education, or suspended or expelled in large numbers, or placed in more restrictive settings in greater numbers than their representation in the whole school or in the school district. I want to focus on the two things that are highlighted in Black. It says specific racial or ethnic group. And also, it's not about the absolute numbers of students who are identified, because it could be relatively small, but that those students are identified in greater numbers than one would anticipate given their numbers in the district. So it's an overrepresentation of those students in special ed or the disciplinary system based upon the numbers that we would expect given how many of them in the district. The second definition, and I'm going to talk about just briefly, is what is significant disproportionality. When a school district, let me mention this first. So the California Department of Education identifies LEAs as significantly disproportionate if in fact they are disproportionately overrepresented for the particular group or indicator for 3 consecutive years. And it requires that states examine the data to determine if significant disproportionality exists based upon race and ethnicity. So we've got to look at it from the perspective of race and ethnicity, although with file reviews, that is not necessarily the case. The CSACE program, and since most of you are probably very familiar with this, with significant disproportionality, you must first of all focus on an ethnic group. And secondly, the indicators, and the indicators may be categories of special education or discipline. When I talk about categories of special education, it could be that it's learning disabled, or it could be emotionally disturbed. But when that overrepresentation happens for a specific ethnic group in one of those categories, the district is required to transfer 15% of its IDA funds from special education to general education to address this issue. The focus is on academic achievement, and in the case of discipline, on behavioral adjustment. So one of the things that's going to be important for me to outline as I talk about this topic is that it's important for us to define what our focus is in order for us to identify how we are going to use this tool within your work setting. There's a philosopher by the name of Seneca who died a little bit before most of you were born. As a matter of fact, he died in 64 AD. And what he says is that if a man doesn't know to which port he's sailing, no wind is favorable. If a man doesn't know to which port he's sailing, no wind is favorable. The goal of the CSACE program is how we achieve excellence in the context of equity for all students. And I believe that part of what we need to do as we approach file reviews is to shape the lens that we will be using to evaluate student achievement and student adjustment. Um, for a minute, I think I have to digress. When I mentioned that I'm going to be looking at it in a different way, I believe very strongly that what we have to do is adapt a sociocultural lens when we start to deal with the file review process and evaluating students' journeys through general education, either through special education, but to any kind of the need to receive additional services. That we've got to understand the journeys of the populations that we're serving in order for us to become culturally competent. I often tell people that the context in which we will be dealing with this topic and the way I deal with most topics in evaluating students is that if you don't understand the journeys of those you serve, you cannot become a culturally competent educator. A little later, I'm going to talk about another term that people are using much more often now, which is called cultural humility, because frankly, cultural competence is not something that's a box that you check off that says, I went to this workshop. That it is very, very difficult for people to feel as if they have gotten to a point where they are competent in being able to see the world from the perspective of all of the diverse populations that we serve. And so when I talk about culture, and this is very important to me, I'm not just talking about race and ethnicity. I'd like you to suspend that and focus on culture as a situation where we're looking at any group of people who have had similar lived experiences, who have had similar journeys that shape how they deal with the world. And frankly, as educators, all we have to bring to the table is ourselves and what our journeys have been. And so when I talk about adopting a sociocultural lens, what we're talking about is creating a process whereby we will be able to suspend who we are, what our journey has been, and try to see the world from the multiple perspectives that we serve. Okay, so one of the things that's very, very important in the file review process is that we have to engage in what I call data-driven decision making. Oftentimes we collect data and we look at it, but we don't use it as a basis for how we make decisions. There are two kinds of data. There's quantitative data and there's qualitative data. I'm sure you've heard both of those terms. When we think about quantitative data, it's usually that we're collecting information so that we understand the nature of the population that we serve. So here's an example. In this case, the district was collecting data on suspensions, and it was looking specifically that the ethnic group that they were focusing on was African American students, and they were looking at what was the percentage of African American student suspensions in the district from 2015 to 2019. You can actually look at that chart and make some decisions just based on that. What does that chart tell you? Anybody who can see can tell that there is a big spike beginning in the 6th grade and that the highest spike was, okay, in the 7th grade. What is that about? But the chart gives us some important quantitative data for us to make some decisions about where our interventions need to happen. Here's another one, which is a very simple, but it's a circular one chart. And all this one is what's the composition? What is the ethnic contribution? What is the ethnic composition of the school district? So one of the things about quantitative data is it focuses on the what. It focuses generally on numbers and percentages, how many or how much. And quantitative data tends to be very objective. And people are very comfortable with that fact because it is, in fact, very, very objective. Qualitative data, on the other hand, doesn't focus on the what, it focuses on the why. So you ask people questions like, so what's your hunch about why this is the case? What do you think the root causes might be? We're looking at people's perceptions, what their opinions are. And a lot of people want to dismiss those things because the responses are very subjective. But qualitative data is very, very powerful because it gives meaning to the quantitative data that we have gathered. And sometimes when we engage in that qualitative data gathering process, it suggests other areas of quantitative data that we need to research that we may not have noticed up to now. So qualitative data can be a variety of sources. It can be in-depth interviews that you have with people where you talk to them about what they think and what they feel, what they observe. Um, if in fact we weren't dealing with distance learning right now, one of the important ways to get qualitative data is to actually go on site and do observations in the classroom and on the campus to get a sense of how it deals with the population that they serve. I often prefer to do equity walks where I actually have either adults, but my preference is to take 2 or 3 students with me on a journey through that campus. And as we go through, ask them certain kinds of questions to get a sense about how they evaluate what it is that they see. The other way to gather that data, many of you have done that, given that you are most of you are administrators, where you have focus groups, where you bring people into a room, and they may be people who of the same discipline or people of different disciplines, and talk to them about a variety of questions to get some sense about their perception of the world. And of course, the one that we're going to deal with today are file reviews as another way to gather data. And many of you have done that in the past. I would imagine that most of the file reviews that you have done are often more to gather quantitative data than qualitative data, but that may or may not be the case. Now, with CSACE, there are some additional qualitative data sources where we get to find out more information that will help us to explain the data that we're observing. One, individual interviews with key individuals. And so, for example, if you had a district that was disproportionate because of, let's say, the ethnic group is Hispanic and the area indicator is learning disabled, you might want to have an interview with the person who is the ELL coordinator, because they would have a very unique vision about that particular population and what it is that might be causing those youngsters to be overrepresented. So individual interviews with people who have a particular perspective that might give you some information. As you know, the CSACE program requires that you identify a leadership team that include primary decision makers in the district, and also a stakeholder group that has a much more diverse population. And those groups are groups from whom you can gather a lot of qualitative data that you can use in the development of your approach. And finally, not finally, but the other thing, our focus groups are done particularly as a strong measure for gathering qualitative data. But we're going to be talking about file reviews in this process. And I think that the 2 administrators who have been a part of this, frankly have had the same kind of experience or similar experience to some of you. So let's hear from them. I asked them, have you conducted file reviews in the past?
Over the years, I've been involved in multiple file reviews, whether it was compliance or self-reviews, guided or unguided, if you will.
And James, how?
I've done file reviews. Part of PIR and our disproportionality reviews, we had file reviews processes where we actually pooled files and sat in a room with a group of people and did the review in person. So we definitely have had experience doing file reviews before for Dispro, where the CDE would give us names that we would pool and actually do those file reviews.
Okay. Typically, when I ask the question, have you ever done file reviews? Typically when people says, of course I have, they are in fact the kind of file reviews that James talked about, that compliance reviews where externally they've been asked to look for certain kinds of things. They call them sometimes educational benefit reviews. There are, as he mentioned, Dispro reviews. Holly talked about self-reviews, but so most of you who responded, I would imagine, are talking about having already had experience with compliance reviews. There's a second kind of review that's often done by an outside person or a consultant who's hired, which are file audits. And what those reviews are looking at, they focus much more on assessment instruments. Did the school psychologists, the speech and language people, the people who did assessments actually use the appropriate instruments? Did they use them? What does the report reflect that they really had the sufficient information in order to reach the conclusions that they did? File audits focus much more on the technical aspects of the identification process. And some of you have done that, and you will sit there and say, well, why did she use that test? Oh no, that's not the one that's appropriate to have made the decision. Or the reason really wasn't enough information in order to come to the conclusion that that student was in fact eligible for special education. So that's a second kind. The one we're going to be talking about today are qualitative file reviews. And what qualitative file reviews do is they focus on the student's pathways to eligibility. Their emphasis, which you're going to hear me say over and over again, because I think it's going to be very important to get out of the vision of compliance reviews that looks at individual students and move into a focus on the file review that emphasizes systems and patterns of determining eligibility for services. Compliance reviews typically focus on academic achievement. It may be behavioral adjustment depending upon the area of concern. And one of the things that's different about them and the file reviews that we're going to be talking about today is their focus is almost exclusively on special education. And they address individual student dysfunction and the extent to which that student truly deviates from the expected norms. And the important part is their assessment of whether or not the district is adhering to required regulations. But let's focus on, for the two administrators, how was this file review different from others in which you participated previously? James.
For this file review for CCIS, what we did is we had to do it virtually. We're in the middle of COVID right now. Our staff are all working remotely. And so what we did is try to come up with a way of pooling files. We took about 19 students. Some were eligible, some were exited, some were DNQs that represented our Dispro core population, which is Hispanic SLD. And so we just started gathering those together. We took all these IEPs for these 19 students that we gathered, and we took off their names, but we kept things like school, grade, ethnicity, and language, home language. And what we ended up doing is scanning all of them into a Google Drive. It was all of their IEPs, initials, and most recent IEPs, completed assessments, evaluation reports from all the service providers. And again, it was uploaded into Google Drive. We use Google Drive all the time, so it's very, very familiar to our staff. And then each participant that we had that we're going to review were assigned 2 of those students. So they only actually saw 2 students in the drive of themselves once we got that process going. So that was very different, right? Because in the past, we would all sit in a room together and we kind of just share certain files. You do 2, I'll do 3, and broke it down at that time. So we had to digitally collect them, and it's much easier now also because of SACE, right? We upload all that information to SACE, so it's not like we had to hand scan every single thing from someone's IEP either. So it was much easier to do that now than it has ever been.
Yes, I made an error and I skipped Holly, so I'm going to be going backwards and see if I can find her actual response to this. I guess not. Okay, well, let me put this whole process now in context. Because part of what I believe is that the problem oftentimes for some of these students in getting some clarity about what it is they need and whether or not we're responding is that we employ a deficiency lens in looking at kids. So part of what is the problem is I believe that the culture of privilege is established as what is normative for everybody else. And that many times we as educators are not aware of the individual and institutional inequities that cause some of our students to be referred. And we're not able, when we are not aware of that, to apply a cultural lens to how we provide service to the students that we must educate. And because we view culturally different children, and when I say culturally different, I want to establish again that I'm not just talking about race and ethnicity. When I talk about culturally different, I'm talking about that group of young people whose way of being is different from whatever the system rewards. Those whose behaviors or their level of academic achievement is not what we would expect in the normative environment that we create. And oftentimes, even as we write reports and we look at, or we review them, we don't focus on student strengths. We don't focus on the cultural capital that those students who are culturally different bring, or that the staff brings, and rather focus on how it is that they deviate from this mythical norm that we have set up. And what that does is it talks about seeing the students from this deficiency model, and it prevents us from being able to identify some of the systemic issues that don't take their sociocultural differences, their sociocultural strengths into consideration. So when I talk about the qualitative file review, it has a broader purpose than the typical compliance one. First of all, we're not just looking at that individual student. What we're doing is documenting that student's journey through the educational system and looking at how the environment responds to the characteristics that that student brings. So in addition to focusing on documenting their journey, what we should be about is looking at the instructional environment, the school environment, the district environment, and analyze how it's serving students who are similar to students like that. And this kind of file review also has a purpose of doing professional development. As you will see when James and Holly talk about the experiences they've had, people learned a lot in that process. And it's almost as if they were bringing those students into the room, bringing those students into their experience, and having to look at those students with the lens of, are we doing the job that we need to do for people who are similar to this child? The last thing that's really, really important is that the purpose of this kind of file review is we want that group of people who are looking at the students from those 3 perspectives that I mentioned previously are being shaped into a team, so that that team has a vision that they will carry to their work. a vision that will shape how they will be able to evaluate students. So one of the things that needs to happen is to assemble this team that we're talking about. And that team may be a team of people who have a single discipline, or it may be a team that has a multidisciplinary group. Um, Single discipline teams have a different purpose than interdisciplinary ones. The video that I missed was one where Holly talked about the fact that her team and her file review was with psychologists exclusively. And I'm sorry I missed it, but she does get to talk about how did she feel about the fact that most of the participants were psychologists, and did that in fact affect the outcome of the file review? Holly.
Our school psychologists had, obviously a unique perspective. They're looking at it from that assessment perspective. They're looking to see that there's a complete picture of the student's strengths and their weaknesses. During the time of our file review, we were also transitioning to using a patterns of strengths and weaknesses model. So they were very well aware of ways to look at students' strengths and to really sort of control against or to be mindful of a deficit model. I think many of our files, as we look through them, what came out of that was that we were using a very traditional deficit model. And I think during the file review, having that team of school psychologists was very helpful because we were really hoping to shift that practice and to move to a more strengths-based approach that could help us see a whole picture, of the whole student and not just focus on the areas of need. So I think, in some ways, I think the school psychologists left that with a lot of aha experiences and a lot of ahas as they approach their work as we came out of that. Also, because we were a unified school district, all of those school psychologists were new to our team. And I think it was helpful. We picked files with a full range of grade levels and identification, initial assessment identification. So we had a broad range of students to consider and to think about. And I know it was helpful as they went back to their work. I know they were thoughtful about it.
There are two kinds of file reviews. She talked about the single one, but when in the actual process, there's several types of file reviews. First of all, those reviews can be very open-ended. And in open-ended reviews, the process is very unstructured. People are given the files to read, and what it is that you will get from them will be very unstructured. You will get their spontaneous contributions to the discussion, what they happen to notice. And the good thing about it is typically you haven't inhibited them. And so they will generate a variety of responses based upon their experiences and based upon the unique perspectives that they have. On the other hand, there are focus reviews, which is something that I typically recommend. And in focus reviews, the goal is that before they begin the file review, that we want to shape the lens of those people who are reviewing those files and focus them in the direction of the outcomes that we would like to have as a result. Again, it facilitates you doing that systems-oriented inquiry as opposed to just looking at student dysfunction. And if in fact you are looking at ethnic groups and specific indicators as required by CSACE, you can ensure that you force them to look at the file from that perspective as well. So the first step in that file review process is to provide what the focus is. You need to know what your focus is to decide if you're going to do a single discipline one or a multidisciplinary one. What is it that you want them to learn from that process is something that you begin that with. And as I mentioned before, if it's CSACE, you also want to shape their lens by saying, here is the ethnic group or ethnic groups that we're focused on, and here are the indicators for which they have been identified. We have been identified as significantly disproportionate. The next thing is you assemble the team. You invite a group that represents a single discipline, as Dr. Wade did with a school psychologist, who were looking at had a particular focus on shaping that team and having them look at and come to some conclusions about what she as an administrator wanted as an outcome in shaping that team going forward and how they looked at cases. Or you can invite a multidisciplinary group of participants. And you pick those people so that you can incorporate multiple perspectives that they bring. And what you're wanting to do with that group, just like with the single discipline one, is to shape that team's vision in considering future cases. So you may have a panel of reviewers that includes administrative instructional support staff who are from general education and special education, and you decide what that composition needs to be based upon whether or not those people are going to be working together, and you would like them to be able to have a vision going forward as they deal with real cases that's consistent. So let me ask Jane, how did you select your list panel of reviewers to participate in the file review? James.
We have been in PIR and now SEP for quite a few years, and we have a committees that meet that's very interdisciplinary. So I sent out an email to about 20 people to get a representative group to participate. I have two gen ed principals, two gen ed teachers, two special ed teachers, 3 psychologists, and 2 speech pathologists that volunteered to do the review. And so that's how we came together. So we've been talking about Dispro and other special education areas of need for our district for like 3 to 5, 6 years almost. And so we're used to working in a collaborative way. So when I put out the message that we need some people to step up to help with this, it was very familiar for them to be able to come together as a multidisciplinary team to review these files, since we've been talking about other special needs things such as inclusion and mainstreaming and things like that.
Great. So step 2, step 1, we've got identified our focus. Number 2, we've assembled the team, and James gives you an example of how he went about assembling his. The next thing, step 3, is we've got to gather the cases that we're going to have them look at. It is much better for the administrator to have selected some student files that might illustrate the issues that students present and that you want that group to be able to notice as they go through the process. The next part is to assemble as much information about the students under consideration as possible. What you often have in doing file reviews, oftentimes all you have is a psych folder, but there's a lot of information that's missing from the psych folder that would be helpful for you to have. There's information in the CUME folder. Their kids often have a discipline folder. There might be a counseling folder. If you have access to more information, it will help you to clarify more what that student's experience had been as they went through the school district. And as he mentioned, it's important to emphasize student confidentiality where it's possible. So he went through a lot of effort to disguise who those students might be. Sometimes people will use student numbers instead of student names because you don't want people to say, oh, I know that family. Oh, I understand why that is. But understand that you don't have to be overly concerned about confidentiality if you're dealing with a panel of reviewers who have access to that information anyway, and there's no problem with them being able to see the data. You still emphasize the fact that they should not share that information outside of the process. So step 4 is to define the task of the group. So part of what I say to people all the time, this process usually requires 3 chunks in order to complete it. The first one is how you define the task to the group. And that part of the meeting, it's good to use a slide deck, but you probably only need a meeting of 15 to 20 minutes. And what you want to do is to share the expected outcomes of the activity before they begin it, provide a brief overview of what the context was and the relevant data that led to the consideration of the file review. So you might want to bring in some of that quantitative data and show them that slide that shows that there is a peak in this grade in when suspensions happen, or there was a large number of students who were referred in grade 3, so that they understand what it is that caused the district to become significantly disproportionate or just disproportionate. I recommend that each participant review a minimum of 3 to 5 files if possible, and that the process allow for there be 2 readings of each file if possible. This is the information that you share with people before they begin the process. It's a brief session. And now the second part of that is when they actually have time to read the file. In his case, when we're dealing with CSACE, they were able to go in and read those files at their leisure, because they could go online and look at their 3 kids or 2 or 3 kids that have been assigned to them and read it and take notes. When you're dealing with an in-person file review, the session happens directly afterwards. You give them the 20-minute overview, you hand them the files, and they have a period of time when they are able to read them right then and there. And as a matter of fact, the third piece, which is them discussing the outcomes, that for that group can happen in that same session. So typically, the kind of file review that I'm talking about, if it's in person, usually takes about a half a day, where they have time during that time to be able to have the post file review discussion to determine what the outcomes were. All right, I suggest, and I'm gonna, you should have in your chat, I'm hoping, a list of guided questions. I have a strong belief that the other thing that helps to shape participants' lens is to give them some sample guided questions that relate to the purpose and the specific group in our indicator. And so what I've given you in the chat is a handout that you can look at afterwards, but page 4 through 6 of the handout has some of these guided questions. But what I'll do, so that you don't have to do that during the session, I'll give you an example of what I mean. General questions that might be there. What discernible patterns were noted in the journeys of many of the students that you reviewed, that you reviewed? What were possible deficiencies or missing elements in the service delivery system that might have contributed to those students' referral for assessment? How about some questions, some guided questions about pre-interventions? A lot of what you select will depend on what the purpose of this review is and what you want the outcomes to be. But for example, to what extent was there evidence of minor interventions or temporary fixes rather than attempts to identify systemic remedies in the institution? Or were reports explicit enough about whether cultural, language, family circumstances, or socioeconomic factors may be impacting the results of psychoeducational assessments? Do you get the feeling? What it's about is trying to shape how they see what they're going to look for when they actually go to the file. For example, in the assessment area, what evidence was there that assessors took into consideration the sociocultural nature of the students under examination in their selection of tools or the evaluation of data? Or something like, did reports reflect any analysis of environmental or instructional factors that may have positively or negatively influenced student adjustment. For example, let's take discipline. If suspensions is the reason that you're wanting to find out how you can change those circumstances in the disciplinary system to affect the students who are typically being referred, what information did you notice that might suggest that there were culturally influenced perceptions of student behavior that define some natural responses that they had as deviants? Something as simple as asking them, what were the typical behaviors that tended to lead to referrals for discipline? Let's assume, for example, that special ed referral, that your indicator in special education was emotionally disturbed. Here are a couple of guided questions. And as you'll notice on the sheet, I've usually put about 7 or 8 just to give you an example. But what I'm hoping is that you will develop your own so that you force people to look at some of the things that were important. What aspects of the student's behavior would lead staff to believe that these students are emotionally disturbed rather than just responding to traumatic circumstances in their lives? Or were alternative labels to emotional disturbance considered, and were there explicit explanations of why they were ruled out? If you'll notice, these are much more in-depth kind of questions that will hopefully generate more thoughtful responses than having people just have an unstructured file review where they often will look at just surface things. For example, if the category was Hispanic SLD, how thorough, well, let me go to, what was your impression about how much the degree of linguistic competence in English affected the performance of any Hispanic students that you reviewed? Or how thorough or comprehensive were annuals or triennial evaluations, and were it clear that they were done with the focus of possibly exiting an inappropriately labeled student from special education, as opposed to having just being a perfunctory review of the past data? So I hope I've just giving you those examples, and that's why I included a number for each category. Hopefully that will help you to get a sense about how you can ensure that the outcomes of the file review will be powerful ones. Again, I'm going to emphasize that the importance of having them look for systemic patterns that the district needs to address. We're not looking at, did the person pick the right test? Yes, that's important, but it's only important if you're going to decide that one of your goals is to have your psychologist come up with a template that for certain kinds of referrals that there will be consistency throughout the district. Then it's important to look at what the tests are and ensuring, did you come out with this conclusion because you used this test as opposed to that one? But what we're much more looking for are, what are systemic patterns that need to be addressed? In the third process, a part of the process, which is the post-review, your people have now read their files, and now they come together to discuss the outcomes. So the purpose is to facilitate a discussion of what people got out of that process. And during it, we should document any possible root causes that might have surfaced during that discussion, and emphasize the ahas that result from the review. What is it that people learn or notice that was new for them as they went through that process? And ensure, particularly with multidisciplinary ones, but with single ones as well, ensure that you got input from a variety of participants. There's some people who are more reticent than others, but they still brought a certain perspective. And when they do reviews or they're talking about students in their work on a regular basis, they are making decisions that impact students' lives. So ensure that everyone talks about what they noticed as they went through that journey with those students. So what happened with James and Holly's experience with their group? And so I asked them, did any participants experience or express any ahas that you think might influence their perceptions or their behaviors going forward? Holly, what do you think?
Having lenses, if you will, or having that same background did influence. And like I said, I think that's where some of them had kind of a visceral response to some of the decisions that were made in terms of the assessments that were done and the findings, potentially how those reports were written. And I think for us at the time, the group was picked specifically because we were trying to move our assessment process to be more strengths based.
Okay. And James, what about your
That
group?
is the power of file review, I find, is that the group would start having aha moments. Their journeys through gen ed, how did they end up in special ed? Through this, people are saying, wow, I think we need more interventions. Or people say, we have different interventions at different schools, because the group that were here were also representatives of many different schools within our school district. Like, we don't have that intervention, or that school talked about some type of intervention that we don't know anything about.
So it is rare that you don't have a very lively discussion after that has happened, because it is rare that if you have provided guided questions to shape the lens, that people don't start to notice things that they might ordinarily not have noticed before. So in the post review session, you might want to start off just like you do with the unstructured open-ended review, by providing participants with an opportunity to spontaneously share their impressions. They always have something to say. But if you want them to dig deeper, you now then can present to them, well, if you remember at the outset, I presented to you some guiding questions for things to look for. And you may now provide those guiding questions and ask them if they notice anything that was in responsive to the questions that you posed at the beginning. Again, I keep saying over and over again, I emphasize the importance of identifying systemic patterns and supports that may be missing. Your goal here is not just to look at how to deal with fixing kids, but it's about systems fixes. And this is a perfect opportunity to have them understand what are the predictable journeys that these students have gone through, and make sure that you document the outcome for follow-up. Another thing that's very, very important in this process to understand is that, remember from the beginning, we talked about the qualitative file review as a vehicle for tracing students' journeys through the educational system. I will often work with, and it rarely is any different, I'll often work with high school districts, and whenever they talk about disproportionality and why they're disproportionate, typically what I'll hear, well, we inherited those students from the elementary school district. And their focus is on meeting with 8th grade folks to find out whatever they tell them about those students. And then a lot of their goals have to do with what kind of placements, what kind of services are being provided for 9th graders. The beauty of this process is not to allow people to blame the system before for why they have students that way. It's to understand how the students got there. And so what that big, thick 3-inch file does is it gives that high school team an opportunity to see that child from the time they were identified until they got to high school. So wait a minute, he was identified as OHI in the 2nd grade. But you know what? It may be that that student may have been, for that particular teacher or at that particular time for that team, that their behaviors, they were ADHD, or they decided that they were, but that might not be the issue at all any longer for that student and what it is that they need. But what's important is for that high school person to be able to see all the supports that happened or did not happen for that student as they went through their journey in elementary school. Secondly, it is not just about what happened, what you need to do for them in the 9th grade as they begin the journey. It's what are you going to do when they're in the 10th? Did you notice in that file that when that psychologist at the high school district in sophomore year did the triennial, that it was perfunctory, that there was not any in-depth searching to determine if this student might appropriately be exited from special education, if in fact we did some things that we needed to do? What were the services that we provided that would have helped that student to now be a 504 instead of going back to special ed? So part of what happens is that there are commonalities that often are discovered as people go through file reviews that help the district to be able to understand what it needs.
What we started thinking about as the group started popcorning out is they started seeing some commonalities very quickly. You would start to see that students were, for example, start off in speech at kindergarten or first grade. That they had documented interventions, but the interventions really were things like move to the front of the class, reduce homework, but were in fact not an actual academic intervention to support their learning struggles.
Did you notice that people from different disciplines notice different things? Of course they did. And part of why the interdisciplinary file review is a much more powerful vehicle than what we do when a single individual sits in a room and reviews files, no matter how competent that person may be. So I want to summarize where we were when I talk about focused file reviews very quickly. You identify the indicator in the ethnic group if that is necessary, that you invite a multidisciplinary group of participants, assemble as much information about the students that you can as possible. In that initial session with them, provide a brief overview of the purpose and share suggested guided questions with participants so that you are shaping their lens and what they should look for as they see the file. Ensure that each participant should review a minimum of 3 to 4 files if time permits, and that there be at least 2 readings of each file if possible. You're going to be sick and tired of hearing me saying, emphasize the importance of having them look for systemic patterns that may have impacted that child's journey. Facilitate a lively discussion of the outcomes and document any root causes for that referral and the ultimate assessment as possible. I guess I wanted to get a sense from the 2 administrators about what they found was the value of file reviews as a vehicle for gathering qualitative information. Holly.
It's a real insightful experience, and I think it helps folks to look back at how a system responds to a student's changing needs, because students' needs do change. And once we get them on a trajectory of receiving the appropriate level of service, you can see that they become more successful. Alternatively, you can see that they haven't made progress, and that's really what I think a file review is helpful for, is to make sure that your systems are appropriately addressing the needs of the students and pivoting and changing with those students as their needs change. So I think involving, again, we only involved a team of school psychologists. I think involving a diverse group of stakeholders in your file reviews can be very, very helpful as you try to ensure that your practices are really holistic and really strengths-based to make sure that students get the services and supports that they need. So I have used file reviews. I've used different scenarios where you just do kind of a deep dive on a student and how they have moved through your system, and it's really an eye-opening experience for some of our staff who maybe are only dealing or thinking about the student in that particular moment in time. But when you look at the history, you really see how your system either has supported that student's growth and strengths and success, and how they have really, in some ways, derailed that student from accessing the appropriate levels of support. So I think a file review, I think looking at student trajectories are really, really important and really helpful ways to make sure that your system is appropriately situated to serve the diverse needs of the students that you are working with.
How about you, James?
And the reason we're in Dispro, most of those students are English language learners as well. So those ideas and aha moments really came out very naturally through this process. And then overall, it started thinking about systemic issues of connecting the district to think more universally about this issue, not just for Hispanic students, but for all of our struggling students in terms of assuring support.
Great. Well, let me give me a rest and give you an opportunity to share some things. I'd like you to take the next 3 minutes in chat to respond to the following question. Based on the information we've presented thus far, what do you think might be a way that this type of file review could be useful in your district as part of the data gathering process, or even as a vehicle for professional development? Let's take about 3 minutes. And although I won't be able to deal with everything that you've written, I'm going to ask Susan to share with me at the end, once we get to the question section, a few of those so that I may respond to them if in fact you have no questions at the end. So Susan, let me know when 3 minutes are up.
Will do. You have about 30 more seconds.
Glad the phone went off during the 3 minutes.
Okay, Mary, there was a lot of really great comments in here. Many folks are talking about how it can really look for systems issues, cracks in the system, as one person put it. Another person talked about how it can take the emotion out of the process of looking at your system and what's going on. Folks talked about it being informative for professional development. For looking at better supports at the tier 1 level. Yes, a lot of talking about multidisciplinary and how valuable that is, and looking at not just the students in this day and time, but their whole history.
Great. I'm really so sorry that I can't see them, but it's very good that I haven't had the opportunity to see them, because I would probably go off and we would be gone until 2:30. But yeah, I think people need to think about in their own setting. And remember, although my focus on this had to do with disproportionality, there are lots of other groups and ways for which file reviews are valuable. You might want to let's look at that population of students who have D's and F's and find out what is it that, or the pattern, what is the place in the system that causes the problem. Not typically when we look at that data, we're looking at student dysfunction, not looking at systemic issues that we could bring, that we need to look at to bring about a change. So thank you very much for sharing some of those, Susan. But remember, I had two goals. One of my goals was that you got an overview of how you might use the file review process. And my second one was, I would hope that some of you um, would feel competent to be able to run a file review yourself following this presentation, if in fact I provided enough information. Um, I did ask Holly that same question. Um, and I think this is the place where she answered that.
It's really important to pay attention to where those crossroads are, for instance. And I think it's not atypical to the district I worked in at the time. I think there are many districts struggling with that tier 2, tier 3 referral for special education, and what does a robust set of interventions look like, and how much time do we give those students to access any type of intervention to see if they will work. But I think for us, what we were trying to do was understand how our system over time had responded, especially because we were all pretty much new to the team. We were able to identify some of the root causes that we saw.
So as a result of that, Holly, do you feel comfortable from this experience facilitating a session on your own as a vehicle for gathering information about students' typical journeys from general education to special education? What does she say?
Watching our TA facilitator with the tools that were brought to the file review, that I could facilitate a file review. I think that having an outside person maybe pushed us a little bit outside of our comfort zone. And I think that that's really important. So certainly I could lead a file review, but I would want to make sure that if I were leading a file review in my own district, that I kept myself accountable for making sure that I was aware of any blind spots that I may have. But I absolutely, after going through the file review, felt that I could lead a file review with a team of folks.
Great. I know that you guys did not actually have the experience that James and Holly had, and so may feel less capable of doing it. But remember, qualitative file reviews are very subjective. And so you have to roll with the punches when you're doing them. And what the next question is will depend on what the last answer was. So it is not the same as quantitative data. It is trying to get as much as we can out of the perspectives that people bring to the setting. And remember that file reviews can be useful for SST teams. Can you imagine how much more powerful an SST team or a care team or cost team or even the IEP team would be if you use that vehicle to get them to start to respect one another's perspectives, to work more effectively as a team, to see kids not just as kids who have problems, but to begin to identify what's missing in the system. Of course, we know that they can be extremely useful in doing CSACE leadership teams and other district forums. So what I'm hoping is that you begin to see it not just as something about students' journey to special ed, but to try to figure out what are those groups of young people who get derailed in the system, and to focus on why it is. I've done the best I can in the time that I have. And I think we have about 15 minutes to respond to any questions that you would like to place in chat before we end.
Thanks, Dr. Bacon. We actually do have some questions that have been rolling in, so let me take a look. Let's see. I'm going to start with the most recent conversation for right now. So Bonnie asked, what are some common indicators and systems issues LEAs look for when first beginning their reviews?
What are some of the, do it one more time, please.
Sure. What are some common indicators or system issues that LEAs would look for when they first begin the reviews?
Well, part of what we find that is, and it depends a lot on what the group was and the ethnic group and indicator happened to be. For example, something that James mentioned earlier, in a district where, and we have a whole county where most of the district were Hispanic, SLD, for lots of in those districts, one of the things we noticed that they may have missed if they were not looking at it with this trajectory is that most of the students were identified for special education in as for speech and language, some in preschool and kindergarten. And these were students who, for whom English was a second language. Sometimes they weren't ELs, but rather Hispanic students who were just socioculturally different. And what I want them to notice, if that was a pattern, that students get identified really early for speech and language, and all of a sudden we find them as SLD in the second and third grade. If you were looking at an individual student, that would just be that student's journey. If we're looking and find out that in 6 or 7 of those cases, that is what was happening, that students were expected to perform at a certain level by the time that they were in the second and third grade, and that's where your spike was, I'd want to give them some guided questions. By a guided question, for example, that would say, what do you notice about the pattern of when students ended up being referred and then subject and then eligible? The other thing that we noticed an awful lot, we want them to notice is to what extent the question, remember I mentioned that question about temporary fixes, to what extent did people really look at interventions that would make a difference? And if in fact they exhausted all of the possible general education interventions that they could have tried before referring a student. But what people will notice sometimes is there weren't any to exhaust. And so that's the kind of thing you want people to look at. That's why I think that it's important that you not just pick kids' cases randomly, but that the person who's going to run the file review and make sure that you have cases in there that reflect that. And I want to say one other thing about it is that you also want people to be looking at cases of kids who were found to be ineligible as well as those who were eligible, because that's going to give you a tremendous amount of information about what are the factors that cause that to happen. I hope that's responsive to your question. It just gave you an example, as opposed to being able to talk about some predictable things that you will see in every single case. Next question.
Sure, give me just a second. Julia mentions, I'd be interested to understand how best to sustain the attention and focus long term, how to build in systems that invite regular review of the data and ongoing reflection, templates, calendars, structures that reinforce the work.
How is she suggesting how you build in structures long term?
Yeah.
I guess part of what I was just talking about is people saying, deciding if they're going to do file reviews, and that'd be very interesting to do. I think it needs to be built into the system where people are given a regular opportunity to participate in this kind of activity, not just about journey to special education, but with a lot of different areas where you see that there are problems that need to be addressed systemically as opposed to problems that need to focus only on student fixes. Um, I don't think that file reviews should happen just because a district has been has been identified as significantly disproportionate, and it's a compliance thing. There should be a commitment to the continuing um, willingness to look at the system from the perspective of how it is serving kids who deviate from what their norm happens to be. And it's kind of, um, is not something that should happen in isolation, I guess is what I'm saying. It should become the way in which we are going to always look at students, particularly when we end up with subgroups of students where there's a significant number of them who are behaving in a certain way or who are learning um, in a certain way, so that we can try to understand what it is that we're not doing as opposed to what it is that they're not doing that meet our expectation.
Okay. And we are running a little short on time, so I'm going to go ahead and give you just one last question. Kai asks, is there value in qualified staff from the same background as the overrepresented students participating in the file review? And if so, what is that value?
Is the question, is there a value in having students who represent that racial or ethnic group or people with that?
Yeah, the same background as the students.
Well, there is always a value in that, because what I talked about is shaping a person's lens and their sociocultural, having that sociocultural lens. Well, oftentimes, but not always, people of the same group already bring that to the table. And one of the things that the file review does when you have such a situation where you have few of those people who represent the kids that we're talking about, is that they don't have a voice. And I think the file review process gives them a voice, and it legitimizes the voice that they bring, because there may be experiences that they have had that other people have not had. See, when I talk about cultural humility, which I did not mention, I mentioned it earlier and said I was going to come back to it. What cultural humility is about is the recognition that it's not just that because I'm a psychologist and I have this information and I have this knowledge, or because I'm an administrator, I have this knowledge, that I bring something more valuable to the table than people's lived experiences. That is just as valuable. And oftentimes it's critical to understand what we're looking at. I do believe that just because people look the same as those children does not necessarily mean that they understand them. So there's a difference between race and ethnicity and culture. But the extent to which you can bring those voices into the room, wonderful. If you can't, however, what the goal of this file review process is about is, irrespective of the race and ethnicity or the background or the culture of the people who are involved in the assessment, that what we're trying to do is to use it as a vehicle for professional development so that they become more knowledgeable. And it does not matter after a while if they have had the same experiences as those students, but rather you created a team that has a vision, that's always asking the right questions, always digging deeper instead of looking at surface things like, what does a person look like? I want to end with just a couple of comments. The file review process is not perfect. There's some limitations. Number one, oftentimes you don't have the full component of participants available. Just like the last question, you often may not have people of that racial or ethnic or sociocultural group who are part of the system. We work with what we have. We didn't read 50 files. We only had, in that room, we rolled in 20. And so, yes, we understand that there's a limited number of files that you're reviewing. And oftentimes you don't have the discipline file and the counseling file and that extra really rich information. But you use the psych file because what you have to realize is, oftentimes in the system, that is the closest thing you have to a compilation of information about students, but you look at it and say, well, wait a minute, they don't do very much in this district around health and developmental. You know, they did this report and never interviewed the parent. So we've got to deal with what's missing, but sometimes that psych file is going to be the richest and most valuable information that you have, which is why you're also training psychologists to do a better job of encompassing students' strengths as well as their deficits, environmental issues that impacted what's going on. So you'll find out that this kid did wonderfully in that third grade teacher's classroom, but the file showed that when they moved, that student had problems in this other one. Well, maybe this is an environmental issue and it's not a problem of the student themselves. The other thing is that people bring different perspectives, and some people are going to say things that folks are going to think are out of left field, but understand that's important, because when they leave, that person is going to be making decisions about children's lives. And so it's important to use that as a vehicle to be able to challenge one another about the perspectives that they bring. Every case is unique. And so you're not trying to make generalizations about all kids who are like that, or every time that is done. But what you want to kids to generalize about them, but we're looking at what in the system can we generalize about, and we know we need to change. The outcomes of the session, people are going to come up with root causes and a whole bunch of speculation. It's wonderful if you have lots, because you can't, it's not about quantifiable data. It's about helping us to understand what we need to do in developing an action plan for dismantling inequities in the system, and helping our staff to perform a shared vision. And once they do, then it becomes possible to enroll other people in the vision. You can now go back to a teacher and said, you know, our team has looked at that, and the reason this referral is not something that's going to go forward is because we think that there's some things that still can be done within the general education program. As I talked about, using it as a vehicle for environmental analysis and identifying areas where there needs to be change. I guess I have a notion that I hope that just within this hour and a half, you have some things that have been percolating in your mind about how you can use this information. I did prepare a handout, which you have in the chat, as I mentioned, which has an overview of what I've talked about during the presentation. It lists about 7 or 8 sample questions in different categories so that you can get a feel for how you will compose your own. And if any of you are interested in a PDF of the PowerPoint, you can contact SPP-TAP. I appreciate I got one last task for you before we close. Please write in chat for my benefit. I'd like you to select one thing that surprised you or something that you'll take away from this session.
So thank you very much, Dr. Bacon. Mary, you are always fascinating. We love having you here with us. We're so very fortunate to have you to be able to share all of your great wisdom and experience with us. I really also want to thank Dr. James Adams and Dr. Holly Wade for being involved in this presentation. I think it's great to hear from people directly who have done this work and have found the value in it, have worked with Mary herself. I really, really want to thank all of you participants. I was reading some of those comments in terms of the use of the file reviews, and we are definitely going to share them not only with Mary, but we're going to use those in some of our own other trainings, because I can hear from your comments, reading them, how much you have gained, not only from your own experience, but also from listening to Mary for the last hour and a half. So thank you very much for participating in this. And again, we hope that you'll respond on the evaluation so we continue to get feedback from you on what you need and how things are working for you so we can support you better. Again, thank you, Dr. Bacon, and goodbye to everyone. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. All right, bye-bye.